women's football reporter for Sun Sport. I've been I joined them full time in 2018, more or less. But I was joined via something called the Vicky Orvai Scholarship as a full-time reporter. Well, not this season, last season anyway. And the Vicky Orvai Scholarship is a program that Sun Sports set up in memory of a trailblazing journalist called Vicky Orvai, who was the first female reporter for a red top. And it was set up to try and encourage more women to get into sports journalism. As mentioned, I primarily cover women's football for Sun Sport, mainly women's Super League stories, but then just in general women's football stories and England and women internationals games. And so that's me.
Thank you, Sandra. Ellen.
Yes, hello. Firstly, happy Women's Day, everyone, and thank you to the NCTJ for inviting me to take part in this event today. I'm an assistant producer at Sky Sports News. I went down sort of not a traditional route into my job, so I started as an apprentice journalist at Sky Sports News rather than going to university. Before I started in the newsroom, I got sent on my NCTJ advanced course, where I achieved gold standard. So I had to do exams in law, public affairs, shorthand, essential journalism, Ofcom, it goes on. So those skills sort of equipped me with everything I needed to start in the newsroom. During my apprenticeship, I spent time with the planning department and also the production department, which is where I find myself now as an assistant producer. I got my full-time role at the end of 2021. And in my job, I sort of write scripts for the presenters, I cut video interviews and work with my team, graphics and reporters and sort of presenters to produce. My light's flickering there, not a good start. But we basically deal with producing the shows for Sky Sports News. I've worked in the Euros, the World Cup, the Olympics, so on and so forth. My favourite sport is football, but I do sort of enjoy and cover all sorts of sports. I am a QPR fan, so that's sort of where my passion started as a young girl. And I remember having a conversation with my parents about sort of what job I'd want to go down. And I remember the exact moment where I was like, oh, what do I enjoy? And sports and TV sort of works together well. So that's the route I decided to go down. And to be honest, it's been a whirlwind. I've never looked back. And I think it's really important now to sort of raise awareness for young girls so that they know the path is there and they can also go down this route and succeed.
Thank you, Ellen. Paddy, over to you.
Thanks, Laura. Yeah, my name's Paddy Davitt. I'm a football editor for a regional publisher called NewsQuest, but I'm based in the east of England, Norwich City. I lead a team of journalists covering Norwich City. Coming up 20 years, actually, this year that I've been in the industry. I don't quite know where that time has gone, but I did a postgrad conversion in journalism. I just did a 3-year undergrad modern history course. Then I did journalism, but then when I was lucky enough to get a trainee sports reporter position for the company I still work for today, I did my NCTJ, which is why this is important to me, that that the skills that I learned on the NCTJ courses have really set me up for the the path that has taken me now to the point where, and this is why I probably wanted to participate today, is I'm now in a position I still produce content, but I actually recruit young journalists, new journalists, aspiring journalists, and some of the trends we're going to get into, I know, in this discussion, I've seen as well in terms of the maybe lack of applicants, and also in terms of then converting to the amount of women that I've seen anecdotally working in my part of the football industry over 2 decades. And that's why I wanted to maybe just give some of my experiences from the side of somebody who's actually trying to recruit and sort of try and get that diversity, because it's massively important. And it'd be great to hear the experiences of the fellow panelists and anybody who's obviously consuming this today. So that's really where I'm coming from it, that, you know, as somebody who's working in journalism, has done for the last 20 years, what I've seen, and some of the trends that I've seen, and those trends are still there today in 2023, and what we can do as an industry and individuals maybe to, you know, move it in a bit more of a positive direction. And it's obviously International Women's Day is a great day to highlight that, I think.
Thanks, Paddy. And Fran.
Hi everybody, my name's Fran Yeoman. I'm Head of Journalism at John Moores University, as Laura said. We have sports journalism as well as journalism courses at undergraduate and MA level, all NCTJ accredited. And Paddy, I've got some fantastic young women about to graduate off the sports journalism courses in a couple of months if you're looking to recruit people, so drop me a line. My industry background is in newspapers, national newspapers, primarily news, at the Times, Independent and the Eye, although I was, by the time I left full-time industry, assistant editor and head of news at the Eye, and so involved in overseeing the whole paper to an extent, and I've been involved in sport, sort of big sport events like coordinating the independence coverage, news coverage of the 2012 Olympics, things like that. So I'm not a sports specialist in terms of my industry background, but I do, I was obviously involved in all of that in industry, and now as an educator, responsible for several hundred sports journalism students, of whom some, but not enough, are women. I look forward to hearing what everyone's got to say.
Thank you, Fran. So to start us off, it'd be great for you all to kind of give your views on why you think it's so important that we have gender equality in sports journalism. It seems like an obvious question, but it'd be great to hear your thoughts on that, and why we need to encourage more women to pursue a career in sport. Sandra, would you like to answer that first?
Well, yeah, I mean, Nielsen Sports Research, the data research company, I think produced some statistics last year where they said more than half of the UK population has an interest in women's sports. And so, I mean, we saw the success of the Euros with the Lionesses. I think back, there was a story that came out, or figures that came out in August that said that at that point, the final between England and Germany was the most watched TV program in the UK. So we saw that, you know, you had a mixture of pundits on there, mostly women, many of them ex-international footballers. We've seen a growing number of women visible in covering sports on television, and also in newspapers. So if you've got that interest from the public in women's sport, then by all means you should have more women in the industry covering and reporting on women's sports. And I think we need to get away. It shouldn't be looked at as, you know, when you have women coming on, it's a quota thing. It should just be mainstreamed. I mean, you want to get to a point where you know, the gender isn't an issue, that you just don't have this, you know, that women are the one or two women in the sports room. It needs to go beyond that, because women in sport are popular. Women's sports, you know, is getting more and more popular. So by all means, you just need to have more representation. And one of the things that was interesting during the Euros was, you know, when you saw the pundits talking about wanting more girls, if they wanted to have the opportunity to play football, the idea of if you can see it, you can be it. So therefore, if you see more, you know, you'll have many girls, young women in schools who might be thinking, well, you know, I'd be interested in doing that, whether it's, you know, being a pundit, being a commentator, being behind the camera, for example, at covering a sports event, or just writing about sports, you know, for a newspaper, or even, you know, setting up their own kind of platform. That if you can see it, you can be it. You can, you know, create this space where women and girls feel that there is a place for me in this industry. It just can't be male dominated, you know, for time immemorial. You just need to move forward. And I don't think that I feel that there are obviously a myriad of issues as to why women might, or young women might feel, you know, this is not the industry for me. It's too male dominated. It's for men. But I think that there needs to, given the interest, there just needs to be more opportunities for women to be encouraged to get into the industry, and then obviously more doors open for them and avenues and routes for them to get in, particularly for, I think, for women coming from low income backgrounds who do have aspirations to become journalists and might feel, well, it's not for me, for economic reasons as well.
Thank you, Sandra. And Ellen?
Yeah, I mean, I agree with the points that Sandra said. I think women's sport's on the up, so why wouldn't you want to be a part of that? You know, Sandra mentioning England women winning the Euros last summer. You had the Red Roses in the World Cup final in rugby. Only the other week, the women's cricket T20 squad reached the semi-final. I mean, you could go on about sort of the upward trajectory of women's sport at the moment. So why wouldn't you want to be a part of that? I think it's a great time to get involved in that. And I also think sort of the people that do work in sports journalism kind of reflects in the output. So the more women that we do have working in several sports sort of journalism organisations, that will increase the chances of more female dedicated sports stories. Not that there wouldn't be in the first place, but like definitely will give an appetite for pushing more stories out there and, you know, help reach the more female audiences, which again will then encourage more women to like join this industry.
Thanks, Ellen. And Paddy, you'd like to see more women, you know, in your team. And why do you think it's important?
Well, for the reasons you know, both the panelists have already stressed. I think I'm right in saying that in the UK, the fastest growing participation sport is women's and girls football. So I translate that to my sector of the sports journalism industry, and that isn't represented at all. So clearly there's a deficit there, and it's kind of how do we move it along? How do we nudge it in a much more reflective direction of how popular football is, you know, in women's and girls sort of sport as well? And ultimately, role models, I think that's the thing I would stress. And I look, you know, if I was to look across sports journalism, it's probably we need to stress, you know, the way I look at it, maybe traditionally, I know it's a much more horizontal terms of points that you can access sports journalism now. You can have a WordPress account, and you can produce content. You can have a YouTube channel and produce content. It's not the old traditional, we need to get away from that thought process. But if you look at TV as opposed to radio, as opposed to maybe more print or legacy type of media, obviously now print industry is increasingly more digitally sort of labelled. But I look at TV and radio, and I look at the role models there are in terms of women in those sectors of journalism, and I contrast it with my part of the industry, and it's night and day. So there's clearly an issue, maybe more specifically in terms of the old legacy type publishing parts of sports journalism, and because that isn't, I don't see that reflected in as I say, TV and radio. There's some real powerful female role models, and I think if this is about encouraging aspiring sports journalists to come into the background, you're looking at people who are there, who are doing it. That's kind of, for me personally as well, you know, I looked at people who were doing this type of work when I wanted to get into the industry, and you look at them and you aspire to be them. So I don't think we can underestimate the absence maybe of, in terms of volume, female women role models in sports journalism. That's probably something that really does need to change.
Okay, thank you, Paddy. And Fran, you've got a slightly different perspective, but why do you think it's important for us to have more women in sport?
I mean, I think all the panelists have made some excellent points and have really kind of hit the nail on the head. But the two things I would say, number one, talent. You know, from a self-interested point of view, if the industry wants the best talent, why would you cut off 50% of the population? I see some fantastic talent among the female sports journalism students, and indeed, you know, all of our students, but some brilliant female sports journalists aspiring here in our department, and one would like to think that the door is equally open to them as it is to the rest of our students. And I don't think, you know, we've talked a lot about women covering women's sport, and I think that's important, but I don't think that female sports journalists should necessarily presume that what they're going to do is cover women's sport and answer entirely that growing appetite for coverage of women's sport, important though that is. I think that just as like the Telegraph is a good example where they have male sports journalists covering women's sports and vice versa, and I think that's really important. And there's research that indicates that 69% of the UK public want equal coverage of women's sport. So talent, sports journalism is journalism, and I think anyone who's been in a newsroom knows that it takes a diversity of viewpoints to spot a line, work out what's going to engage an audience, and there's a self-interested sort of motivation for the industry to want that in sports journalism, just like in any other kind of journalism. And then there's a kind of slightly more, academic or ethical, social imperative to welcome women into sports journalism, which is the things that people have touched on here around, to be fair and to be representative of society, and to show women that sport is as open to them as it is to men, and sports journalism by extension is as open to them as anything else. There was some research just last week from This Girl Can about the enjoyment gap in terms of participating in sport. Women are much less likely to enjoy participating in sport than men, and the more that we as journalists can do to show them, to show women that sport is for everybody, and reporting on sport is for everybody, that's got to be kind of good for society as a whole, as well as those kind of slightly more industry specific reasons.
Thank you, Fran. Now, Paddy, you mentioned role models, and it is, as I said in my intro, it feels like there is a lot more visibility of women in sports journalism. We saw, those, big events last year that certainly in broadcast and national press, it feels that there's, an increase in female sports journalists. And I just wonder if you have a view on why has that happened suddenly, and do you even agree with that, actually? Sandra, would you like to start us off, please?
Well, yeah, I mean, when you look at, for example, Sky, in terms of how they've innovated in terms of the coverage of sport, and I see them as quite a really good example of bringing forward more, just having more women visible on screen in front of camera. And but over the last decade, I mean, you look at someone like Sue Smith. I mean, she's been doing her stuff as a football pundit commentator for Sky for years, and is at the very top of her game in terms of what she does. And I mean, I think they've played quite a key role in terms of making women more visible in sport. But then also we've seen it with the BBC more. For example, well, I'm just thinking with my football head on now, just in terms of with the for example, with the Women's Super League and that kind of groundbreaking television deal with the BBC and Sky covering top flight women's football. I agree with Francis that it shouldn't just be that women are covering women's sport, but what's been quite good is seeing more female football pundits, particularly ex-players, on these platforms covering the women's game, but then also just football in general. And I think, I mean, women do have an interest in sport. In terms of football, there are many women out there who go to matches, go to games, whether it's Premier League, Championship, or even non-league, for example, and perhaps it may have been that women's interest in sport hasn't been given as much attention as it should have been. And I think that kind of dovetails with what you're seeing in terms of more female journalists coming into sport, and more ex-players or ex-athletes covering who are female covering sports in general. And I just think also the growth of interest in, for example, women's football, or women playing cricket and rugby. I think that, for example, women's football and cricket's one of amongst the most popular sports to be watched on television. I think that's kind of dovetailed with more women entering the sports industry, and I think that's contributed to that interest.
Thanks, Sandra. And Ellen, would you agree with that? And first of all, we should say that that you are from Sky Sports News, which does invest heavily in female journalism. Would you agree with that?
Yeah, I definitely agree with the points Sandra made. I mean, I think there's a lot more credibility and respect now for the women that have sort of paved the way in sports journalism, whether that goes from your presenters such as Laura Woods, or your pundits such as Sue Smith or Alex Scott. I mean, they've sort of shown that the success that they've had on the field, they've also now implemented into the sports journalism industry, and that it's an opportunity they've created themselves. And it's nice to see that even on social media, they do get sort of applauded for good points they make, and it's not all sort of abuse going their way. I do think there has been an increase in women working in sports journalism during the last 5 to 10 years. I mean, I am one of those in the last 5 years. I think there's no reason there shouldn't be that increase, because there are lots of opportunities out there. So yeah, I mean, I think the more visibility there is, the more likely young girls will be able to see the path. So definitely it's an upward trajectory.
Thanks, Ellen. And Paddy, from your point of view, you kind of said earlier that you have difficulty attracting women into your team, and it feels like the role models might be very visible, you know, it might be high profile, but actually in your area, in more the regional press, it feels that that's not translating into people coming your way. Is that true?
Certainly, yeah. Anecdotally, through my narrower focus of the regional football media, that is very much the case. Yeah, I mean, you know, I won't go into specifics, but as I said right at the outset, I now increasingly recruit to look for aspiring, more junior sports reporters. And the last 2 cycles that we've actually recruited, the time before, we interviewed, I think, 6 candidates, 2 of whom were women. 1 got down to the last 2. We didn't appoint because the other candidate was just an outstanding, had the whole experience and the skill set. But then about 18 months later, there was an internal change around. I needed to recruit again to our team, and I proactively reached out to actually the other woman who we'd shortlisted, who didn't really have the experience for that role, but would have been perfect for this more sort of junior entry level role. She was basically working in news reporting. That was her day job, but she'd really had a passion for women's football and the biggest team in her area of the country. She had, separate to her day job almost, had built up this. She was doing podcasts, she was covering the games, but all in her own time essentially. But as a candidate, she would have been an outstanding candidate. So even before we actually advertised that position, I proactively reached out to her again and said, look, this is just a mighty card. This is coming round. I think if you apply for this, you're going to be a really strong candidate. And she basically said she'd left the industry, that she was no longer now working in journalism or particularly aspiring to be a football journalist. And I must confess, I didn't speak to her to actually, drill down into why that was. But for me, and to complete that story, we had no applicants from women for that last time that we actually, were looking to actively recruit. So why that is, there's probably a lot of reasons, but I can only talk from my direct experience that, we do find it very difficult to actually recruit women to come in and work in the regional sports industry, and whether there's more, as I say, because the role models there in radio, we've talked about brilliant journalists like Laura Woods, or in terms of sports journalism broadcasting wise, Gabby Logan, Hazel Irvin, fantastic female role models. I don't think necessarily, I mean, Sandra talked about Vicky, it was a really powerful presence, sadly no longer with us, but Janine Self was another one. But if I just look at it, in 20 years, I've 9 months of a year on, every week I'm in a different press box, I'm in a different press room, and Sandra said something which really chimed with me, that it shouldn't be that it even becomes a thing that there are women in a newsroom, there are women in a press box. That shouldn't be a thing, and if it is, and it still feels that is the case, then we haven't moved enough, I don't think, certainly in my part of journalism, which is, as I say, more legacy publishers. Thank
you, Paddy. Or as Fran said, she might have some people she
very happy to
I'll sort you out, Paddy.
That's excellent. Thank you.
And I would actually just say that one thing, I know you're going to go on to talk probably later about the percentage of female students on sports journalism courses. It isn't exclusively, of course, graduates of sports journalism courses that go on to be successful in sports journalism. And it may be that there are women coming through general journalism courses or other forms of, courses with other titles who equally have things to offer in this field. We have had a fantastic student, Beth Lindop, who graduated just last summer, who is now on the women's football team at Reach. And that there is a wider pool of potential female talent out there beyond the albeit low percentage of students who are on the sports journalism courses, notwithstanding the fact that we need to increase that. On your question about the increase of women in sports journalism, though, I would say, it's fantastic to hear all the positive experiences of sort of Sandra and Ellen and and graduates like ours, like Beth. And I know it's International Women's Day, but I suppose I would just introduce a note of caution, I suppose, echoing more what Paddy said, that this is from a very low bar, that this improvement is coming. And I also do think there's a distinction between what's happening in print and digital and broadcast, where there are these kind of visible role models. And I did a little spot check this morning of 3 national newspapers, and there was 1 female byline in the Guardian sports section, 1 in the Telegraph, and none in the Mirror, whereas the BBC Sport homepage was absolutely, I didn't count it all up, but very, really clear, visible women's sport and women's bylines. And that's not statistically representative of anything, but I think it's worth just bearing in mind the bar from which we're coming and what's happening in print. And like the shortlist for the British Journalism Awards this year, 1 out of 7 finalists were women. That was Suzanne Rack at The Guardian, who was the same woman who had the byline in The Guardian this morning, So there is a lot still to be done. And also, I think we've talked about visibility, and visibility is, of course, important. But we also need to think about those people in decision-making roles sort of behind the camera and, around the editorial table, as opposed to the kind of byline photoed columnist slots and things like that, which are important for the message that they send. And those women do great work, but those kind of decision-making, culture establishing roles need to be gender equal as well.
Thank you, Fran. I mean, do we think that there are still barriers, or and if so, what are they, and have any of you experienced them? Sandra, would you like to start with this?
Yeah, I mean, it's a great point that Francis mentions there, just in terms of the caution. I mean, but barriers aside, I mean, there have been times, for example, when I was at the Euro, I think I went to one of the games at Brighton, and I just in the media room before going out to go and sit in the stadium, I looked around, and aside from Hope Powell, who walked past me and tapped me on the shoulder, I was the only Black person in the room, the only non-white person as well in the room, and that in itself can be, jarring if you're looking to come into this industry when you're literally the only face. And just in terms of statistics, BComs, who are a group who basically working to try and improve diversity within sports media, they pulled together some figures, I think, for last year, and according to their data for the men's Euros, they said that 3 out of 78 of journalists in the written media that were covering the men's Euros were women. And then they also have something about that just one of those women were from Black or minority ethnic backgrounds. So the barriers are there, and for some people entering, or young people, or even career changers. I mean, I'm career change. I entered journalism quite late, but for some young people coming into journalism, it's not so much that, just the visibility thing of looking and seeing, well, there's not anyone like me there, and that puts me off. It's also an economic issue. You might have people who are aspiring journalists or want to be reporters, but come from less well-off or low-income backgrounds, and then they might see a trainee reporter salary and see something like 15,000 and think, well, I just can't do that. And that might explain why, in some instances, the gender aside, the industry's quite middle class. So those things are factors. For example, perhaps both perhaps for women and but men in general, just for people in general. But the barriers might be economic ones, because when you have young people coming from less well-off backgrounds, You know, if they see a trainee's salary and it's particularly low, they have responsibilities that they need to take care of. It might be a little bit, you know, off-putting for them to want to enter the journalism industry in general, let alone the sports journalism industry. So those are some of the issues that need to be considered when you know, look, when you're for women, for example, who want to enter journalism, but just for people who want to enter sports journalism as well. Just if the salaries are low and they come from a background and they think, well, do I want to take this job on, or do I want to consider something that's higher paid? These are factors as well, I think.
Thank you, Sandra. And Ellen, from your point of view, have you personally encountered any barriers, or have you seen any, you know, during your career?
I think firstly, I just want to say that's some really important points Sandra's just made, and they do need to be addressed. Fortunately, from my point of view, I haven't experienced anything like any sort of barriers. I've been very fortunate the opportunities I've been given since starting as an apprentice at Sky. I mean, I got asked to work on the transfer shows in January and August, and I jumped at that opportunity. I think it's any opportunity you get given, it's important to take. But I do think it's worth taking into account, sort of like with my job, I work shifts. So this morning I was up at 2 a.m. And it's very unsociable hours. So, I mean, as say, if you become a parent or a mother, I mean, working shifts and dealing with childcare would be a struggle, you know, working difficult hours, perhaps during the school pickup run and things like that. So there are several different sort of elements we could look at this, where there are barriers for women in sports journalism.
Thanks, Ellen. And Paddy, what's your view on barriers?
Well, I mean, to follow on from Ellen's point, I think that is a great point, because as we all know here, it isn't a 9 to 5 Monday to Friday job. It's anything but. You know, 9 months, as I said earlier, of the year, the football season, I would work every Saturday and Sunday, and then very unsociable hours. You know, the transfer window, you can be working at any point of any day, and that does take a huge commitment. My wife is a political journalist, and we have a 2-year-old, and trying to balance the work and the life is very challenging at times. So that definitely is, I think, a factor. I was trying to think about this more broadly, and obviously, you know, I probably can't talk about it from somebody who's experienced barriers in that regard. But when I first came into the industry, it was very, and as I say, we're going back quite a number of years now, but certainly pre-social media era. But there was a very, it felt like a closed shop, you know, even for me as a male going into a male-dominated industry, and almost a herd mentality, particularly when you would interact with more senior national sort of journalists, that they almost went around together. And I think a lot of that was they feared that if one broke off and had a different line, that their sports editors would be, why have they got this line, you haven't got it? And that seemed to foster an almost closed shop mentality, and you did feel like an outsider trying to penetrate that. And I can only imagine that's magnified maybe because of the lack of sort of representation, certainly in my sector of the sports journalism industry, and whether that still persists today. Again, I'm probably not qualified to talk about that, but there are barriers, no doubt about it, because ultimately the numbers that I see in terms of applying for jobs, the numbers who I see in press boxes at stadiums aren't representative of, you know, the amount of women and girls who are interested in football, who are playing football, who want to be part of this football industry in whatever form that is. You know, we're talking about journalism, but there's so many other roles, you know, governance roles within football clubs. You know, how many chief execs do you see? You know, Karen Brady's always held up as an example, but how many others are there in senior executive roles, not only within football clubs, but in football organisations, the FA or the Premier League or the Football League? I think football in general needs to be much better, and it is changing, but maybe the pace of the change needs to accelerate a little bit.
Thanks, Paddy. Fran, I'm just going to come to you and ask you a different question, but kind of connected really, is that you're kind of seeing firsthand, you know, ambitious young women coming through and signing up to your courses. What's the feedback that you're receiving in terms of barriers, and do you have anything, you know, positive you can share in terms of how you're actually bringing people in?
Sure. I mean, without wanting to sort of sugarcoat things or pretend that everything is perfect, I would say that the young women that we see graduating from our sports journalism courses, bearing in mind the MA's only had 2 graduating cohorts, and the BA 3, and you know, they're not big numbers, but the students are going on and doing good things, and I do think that entry level things are improving. I've mentioned Beth. We've got a master's student, Matilda, who's going off, smashing it up in terms of cycling journalism and doing great things. That said, journalism is a competitive industry for everybody, and I'm not guaranteed, you know, wouldn't guarantee anybody a job. Just on the barriers point, I would say that actually probably where I see anecdotally the barriers come less at entry level these days and more perhaps at that mid-career level around career progression and promotion, which often happens at, you know, roughly the same time of life as people are starting families. And I do think that the industry as a whole, and sports journalism in particular, still has a lot of kind of informal practices and promotion and appointments based on contacts and pints in the pub and who you know. And whilst it's fantastic to hear that Paddy and his partner are, you know, trying to balance things and both trying to deal with the pickup and all of that, and there is no reason why the male sports journalists couldn't be dashing home to do the nursery pickup as much as the women. I think journalism is a reflection of its society, and the reality is that's not how it operates a lot of the time. And I do think that a bit more imagination about working practices and recruitment practices to ensure that those sort of mid-career women who have loads of talent don't feel that, you know, they have to step away at the point at which they have families. On the point about what we're doing here and bringing women into the industry, I should say, although we, as I understand it, have a significantly above average percentage of women on our MA sports journalism, at least, and that's brilliant. It is still only just under a third, and you know, so there's a long way to go, and I'm not at all complacent that will carry on. Although anecdotally, this year's applicants are about a third women as well, and hopefully they will come and stay and thrive. And we do things to try to encourage them in. Both, and in some ways it's easier at MA level because we interview, because you have a closer relationship with the applicant, and you can talk to them and you can make it clear to them that we consider women's sport to be important, that we use female role models, we can foreground the female expertise that we've got in the department. So I think that says something about, that's some of the reason why the MA is perhaps more female than the undergraduate course, although the undergraduate course is slightly above average here, and you know, there's more to be done. But I think, just as in industry, it's really important that we in academia don't see the end goal as getting people through the door and, you know, getting students in and getting their tuition fees and then that's job done. Just like getting a female student into an entry level job isn't job done. It needs to be about supporting them all the way through their career and with that progression. I think, you know, for us, we need to make sure the students are supported once they're here, not just that they want to come in the first place. So we're trying to do things like making sure that we cover all kinds of sport, and that's women's sport, but also men's sport other than football, because it can all become a bit one-dimensional. If you go with the majority all of the time, the majority will be men's football, and without wanting to pigeonhole female interests, it's not always men's football. We participate in things like the BBC 50/50 project, so we get students on practical modules to monitor the gender balance of their interviewees, and that is really good in terms of raising awareness of who they're quoting all of the time, both in news and sport. My colleague Polly and I are looking at diversifying the teaching examples we use so that all of our students feel represented, whether that's women on the sports journalism courses or other people who are demographically unrepresented on our courses. Bringing in guest speakers who are women and who are from different backgrounds. I think, again, it's that whole you can't be what you can't see thing that other people have mentioned. And then finally, I would just say listening to the students and not assuming what the women sports journalism students, or indeed anybody else who is in a minority, wants. So we have a fantastic female sports journalism course rep. She's one I'd hire, Paddy, if she wants to come to. But, you know, talking to her, like, do the minority of female students want to be in one workshop group so they've got that solidarity, or do they want to be dispersed so that there isn't this kind of ghettoizing? Do they want a female personal tutor even if that person isn't a sports specialist, so that they have that kind of mentor relationship? Or do they want, you know, a football specialist because they really want to get into football as their personal tutor? You know, what do they want to cover? What is going to help them, and not kind of us assuming based on our experience what is going to help. Those are the things that I'm trying to do and we're trying to do here. We've got a long way to go, and if there are other kind of sports journalism educators on the call, I'd love to swap notes on what else you're doing. But it does, you know, we are making progress, and hopefully we'll continue to do so, because the industry needs our people. So
yeah, absolutely, Fran. That's a really important point. Actually, there are jobs out there, and the industry wants female sports journalists. I'm kind of conscious of the time. Believe it or not, we've kind of almost run out, and this conversation could go on for much longer. And you know, and I'm sure it will in you know, outside of this forum. So I'd just like to finish off by asking our panelists for aspiring sports journalists, actually of either sex, of any background or experience that's on the call today, what advice would you give about getting into sports journalism? And Sandra, could I start with you?
Yeah, I mean, my route, I mean, I didn't explain at the beginning, my route into journalism is slightly unusual in that I changed careers. I've come into this industry quite late, basically in my, you know, late 30s, early 40s, after years of working in the charity sector. But whilst I'd always wanted to go into sports journalism, but for one reason or other, it never quite come off. But I'd say, you know, if you're in that position where you're looking to, if you're happy to be an NCTJ student and you're looking to change careers, you're already working somewhere else, don't be put off by attempting to break into sports journalism. Even at a later point in life, you know, take the opportunity if you can to, you know, get experience if you've got the free time, when you've got free time, but then also don't be scared to, for example, if you've got the space and the time and you've got the local papers there, you've always read the stuff, but you've not had the time to cover things like contacting your local paper and just, you know, offering an opportunity to cover a sports event, or to you know, do some sports reporting, and taking that opportunity if it's provided to you. I would also say, yeah, as Paddy mentioned, like looking at the non-traditional forms of doing sports reporting. So I know that loads of people who are on the NCTJ courses may have their own blogs, their own forums, their own platforms, just making use of that to create your content so you build up your portfolio. But then by all means, networking, I think, like, for example, looking at things like the Women in Football Network, approaching organizations like BComs, or finding out about organizations that might offer you a route in, for example, like Creative Access. There's a scheme that's something that might offer a route into sports journalism. Just finding out about the different ways in. It's not necessarily just about, okay, going to the publication or outlet and just seeing what jobs are available. There are so many opportunities out there. It's just, I guess, a matter of the research, but then also going to the NCTJ itself and just, you know, taking advantage of the resources that you've got that can offer people a route into journalism.
Thank you, Sandra. Ellen?
Yeah, I mean, agree with everything Sandra said there. I mean, I always say to people, and people always used to say to me, contacts. I mean, before I applied for my apprenticeship at Sky, I attended a couple of journalism insight events there. So there I was able to meet like previous apprentices that had taken up the role I went on to take. And I remember once I got my job, I sort of did a similar talk to other students that were interested in the industry, and I met Amrit Man, who's now on our content academy at Sky. So it just goes to show that's a classic example of being in contact with someone can help sort of you go into the industry and be a success that way. I think it's important to believe in yourself first and foremost, and sort of, as Sandra said, research the industry, the qualifications you'll need. And I think another way could be sort of maybe give yourself a bit of a niche, make yourself stand out. Of course, it's absolutely fine and normal to have your favorite sports, but maybe expand your knowledge across all sports, sort of give yourself the best possible chance of sort of, you can take any opportunity rather than being narrowed to specific ones. But yeah, as Sandra said, there's so many opportunities out there, so definitely go for it. I mean, you've got nothing to lose, and I'm sure it'll all work out in the end.
Thanks, Ellen. And as we keep saying, there are jobs out there. Paddy?
Yeah, sorry, I'm just Patrick's comments throwing me. Lack of men on this Zoom highlights the issue, which ultimately it does really, doesn't it? But no, Ellen's point is a great one in terms of niche, because coming at it from a recruiting look, the niche within football journalism as well, because rather than everybody wants to cover the Premier League, of course they do, that's the pinnacle, or international football or whatever, but we've just partnered with there's a student who's on a course at the UEA here down in Norwich, and their passion is stats and data, and that's a massively expanding part of the football journalism. But there's a niche there because there's not too many doing it with a real expert analysis. He's basically combining what he's learning on his course at the present with his passion for, in this case, Norwich City. And we've partnered with him. He's doing analysis for us around the Norwich games. Through that, he's getting exponentially a huge amount of traffic and traction on his social media accounts. And he's basically, it's looking for those gaps that aren't maybe being served. If you're coming at it from how do I get into this industry? How do I get myself noticed? Just look for the gaps, and also look lower down in terms of the sport per se, or football specifically. It's not all about trying to get in and immediately start covering Premier League games of football. There's so many different levels of football that aren't really covered because of the resources that a lot of publishers have got now. They can't really be at lower level football games, non-league games, and there's a twofold thing there, because you can get the exposure, but you can also learn your craft as well, away from kind of, obviously if you start covering Premier League games, there's an expectation you need to be at a certain level in terms of your proficiency and your expertise. So learn your skills away from the spotlight, and then look for a niche, is what I would always say to any prospective sports journalist, is come with something new to the table that maybe others aren't offering, basically.
Thank you, Paddy. And Fran, last but not least.
Oh, thanks. It is striking, isn't it, the relative lack of men on the call, thanks to Patrick, who mentioned that. And actually that point about allies and having male allies in this is really important, and this isn't a problem for women, this is an issue for the industry as a whole. So go and find the men and tell them to be on the next one. But in terms of advice for anyone out there who is looking to get into sports journalism, absolutely a niche, absolutely get your skills. What Paddy said, sports journalism is journalism, and you need to know what a news story is. You know how to write a news story, you need to know how to keep yourself out of court, all of the kinds of the things that the NCTJ qualifications and a good sports journalism course will help you with. You'll get laughed at if you can't do basic journalism. So yes, a specialism and an interest in sport, but yes, this is about journalism. I would say, do a good course, but then I would say that if you're not completely sure about sports journalism, or you are a bit overwhelmed perhaps about the numbers or about something else, I would say try not to be, but also do bear in mind that if you do a solid journalism degree, that should give you the opportunity to do some sport and get the skills, and there are still jobs there, and you can still get into the industry with a journalism degree. It doesn't absolutely have to be sports journalism, notwithstanding the fact that this call is partly about increasing numbers on sports journalism courses. And just soak in as much journalism as you can. Watch, read, listen, absorb how the professionals are doing it, men and women, and have a go yourself. As people have said, start a blog, go on a YouTube channel, have a go at writing, join your student newspaper or local or school newspaper, whatever you can do. Things like the BBC Young Reporter are fantastic if you're at school age. Try things out, give it a go. And then I would say, just finally, if you do get through the door, support as you climb, right? Don't be tempted trade on your position as the female reporter in a traditionally male dominated field, whether that's sport or something else. You know, open the door to more women, bring them in through, bring them up with you, because you'll be really glad that you did in the long run. So.
Thanks, Fran. Great words to end on. Well, thank you everybody for attending the session today, and thank you to our brilliant panelists. This is a huge topic and an important topic, as we've heard today, and I just felt like we didn't have quite enough time, so I think it's something that will definitely stay on the agenda.